Have you ever wondered why, in an age where we can answer almost any question with a few taps on a screen, so many people still feel that something essential is missing? We know how to build machines that think. We know how to map distant galaxies. We know how to prolong life, predict storms, and communicate instantly across continents. And yet, one question remains strangely unanswered. Why do so many people wake up with the unsettling feeling that their lives have lost direction? Perhaps this is the greatest paradox of the modern world. Never before has humanity possessed so much information. Never before have we had so many ways to entertain ourselves. Never before have we been so connected. And yet, loneliness grows, anxiety grows, the search for meaning grows. Carl Jung believed this was no coincidence. He observed that when human beings lose contact with the symbolic dimension of life, they do not simply lose old stories. They lose the inner language through which the psyche understands itself. But if that language has been forgotten, where can it still be found? Surprisingly, not in philosophy, not in science, not even in religion alone. Jung and his closest collaborator, Marie-Louise von Franz, believed that one of its purest expressions had survived in a place most modern people had stopped taking seriously: fairy tales. Not as charming fantasies, not as bedtime stories, but as psychological maps. Logical maps drawn long before psychology existed. Maps that describe fear before we have words for fear. Transformation before we understand change. Wholeness before we even know what we are searching for. This may sound impossible. After all, how could stories about forests, wolves, witches, kings, forgotten children, and impossible journeys reveal anything about our own lives? That is precisely the mystery we are about to explore. Because if Jung and von Franz were right, then fairy tales were never written to help us escape reality. They were created to help us find our way through it. And perhaps, without realizing it, the story you are about to hear has been telling your own story all along. There was a time when people did not turn to search engines for answers. They turned to stories. Not because stories explained the world in a scientific way, but because they explained something even more important: what it meant to be human. Long before psychology, long before universities, and long before the first books on philosophy were ever written, generations gathered around fires, in villages and castles, carrying with them tales that traveled farther than kingdoms and lasted longer than empires. They spoke of children who entered dark forests, of kings who lost their kingdoms, of queens trapped in impossible winters, of wolves waiting in the shadows, of strangers who appeared at exactly the right moment. To modernize, these may seem like fragments of fantasy, simple stories created to entertain children before bedtime. But history tells a different story. For most of their existence, fairy tales were never intended for children. They belonged to everyone. Adults listened to them. Travelers carried them across continents. Families preserved them through memory alone, generation after generation, long before anyone thought of writing them down. Something about these stories was too valuable to lose. But what? Why would entire civilizations preserve tales filled with impossible events, magical creatures, and mysterious symbols? What were they trying to remember? Carl Jung became fascinated by this very question. The more he listened to his patients describe their dreams, fantasies, and inner struggles, the more he noticed something extraordinary. The same symbolic patterns appeared again and again, not only in dreams, not only in myths, but also in the oldest fairy tales humanity had ever told. Different cultures, different languages, different centuries, yet the same forests, the same journeys, the same mysterious helpers, the same terrifying adversaries. It was as though these stories were not invented by isolated individuals. They emerged from somewhere much deeper, a place shared by every human being. Marie-Louise von Franz would later devote decades of her life to understanding this mystery. She came to believe that fairy tales were perhaps the clearest mirror of the human psyche ever created, not because they describe historical events, but because they describe psychological realities. They reveal what happens when fear takes control, when courage awakens, when innocence is lost, when wisdom appears, when the personality breaks apart, and when, against all odds, it begins to become whole again. Perhaps this explains why these stories refuse to disappear. Empires have fallen, religions have changed, languages have evolved, technology has transformed nearly every aspect of our lives. Yet fairy tales continue to survive, not because they belong to the past, but because the human soul continues to ask the same questions it has always asked. Who am I? Why do I suffer? What am I searching for? And how do I find my way when everything familiar disappears? This is where our journey truly begins. Because before we can understand any fairy tale, we must first understand why humanity never stopped telling them. Imagine someone from 1,000 years ago suddenly waking up in our world. They would see cities glowing through the night, machines carrying people across the sky, and tiny devices capable of answering questions that once occupied the greatest philosophers. They might believe they had arrived in an age where humanity had finally solved the mystery of existence, but it wouldn't take long before they noticed something unexpected. Despite all this extraordinary progress, many people move through life carrying an invisible weight they cannot easily explain. It is not simply sadness, nor is it ordinary dissatisfaction. It is the quiet feeling that something essential has slipped away. A sense that life has become increasingly efficient while somehow becoming less meaningful. Modern culture offers us countless ways to stay occupied, yet very few opportunities to ask why we are doing any of it in the first place. We are encouraged to pursue success, accumulate experiences, improve ourselves, and remain constantly connected. But beneath the endless movement, another question quietly waits. What is all this for? This is not a new question. Every civilization has faced moments when old certainties began to collapse. Every generation has encountered periods when familiar beliefs no longer provided the guidance they once did. The difference is that previous cultures often possessed a symbolic language that helped people navigate these inner seasons of uncertainty. Today, that language has become increasingly unfamiliar. Carl Jung believed that modern people had not become less spiritual or less imaginative. Instead, they had gradually lost contact with the symbolic dimension of experience. We continue to dream. We continue to love, fear, grieve, hope, and search. But we often attempt to understand these experiences using only the language of logic, efficiency, and analysis. Yet the deepest movements of the human psyche rarely speak in concepts. They speak in images. They speak in symbols. They speak in stories. Perhaps this explains why moments of profound crisis often leave us searching for metaphors rather than explanations. We describe feeling lost in a forest, trapped inside a labyrinth, haunted by invisible shadows, or standing before an unopened door. Without realizing it, we instinctively return to the same symbolic images that have accompanied humanity for centuries. Maybe these are not merely figures of speech. Maybe they are echoes of an older psychological language that has never truly disappeared. And if that is true, then the greatest loss of the modern world is not that we stopped telling fairy tales. It is that we forgot how to listen to what they were trying to tell us. Today, it is almost impossible to separate fairy tales from childhood. The moment we hear names like Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, Snow White, or Sleeping Beauty, we imagine colorful picture books, animated films, and bedtime stories whispered before sleep. But that image is surprisingly recent. For most of human history, fairy tales belonged to the world of adults. Long before they were printed in books, they lived only in memory. They traveled with merchants crossing dangerous roads, with pilgrims moving from village to village, with grandmothers gathered around winter fires, and with strangers whose names have long been forgotten. Every storyteller added a detail, removed another, yet somehow the heart of the story always survived. That alone should make us pause. Entire civilizations disappeared. Kingdoms rose and fell. Languages evolved. Religions transformed. Yet these stories endured, not because anyone forced people to preserve them, but because generation after generation instinctively felt they carried something worth remembering. What exactly was it? It certainly wasn't historical information. Fairy tales never tried to tell us what happened. Instead, they revealed what always happens. A child leaves home. A stranger appears. A difficult choice must be made. Fear blocks the path. Something precious is lost. Something unexpected is discovered. And the person who returns is never the same as the one who left. These patterns appear so consistently that they begin to feel less like inventions and more like observations about life itself. The settings may change, the characters may wear different faces, but the journey remains remarkably familiar. This is why fairy tales continue to resonate, even when we no longer believe in magic. Because somewhere beneath the talking animals, enchanted forests, and impossible kingdoms lies a truth that does not depend on whether dragons ever existed. The dragon is not important because it once walked the earth. It is important because every human being eventually encounters something that feels just as terrifying. The forest matters because every life eventually enters a period where the path disappears. The treasure matters because every transformation asks us to discover something more valuable than what we first believed we were seeking. Fairy tales survived because they spoke the language of experience rather than the language of facts. They addressed the questions that every generation inherits, but no generation can avoid. How do we face fear? How do we survive loss? How do we become who we were meant to be? Centuries later, these same questions would capture the attention of a Swiss psychiatrist who began noticing something impossible to ignore. The stories humanity had been telling for centuries seemed to resemble the stories the unconscious was still telling every single night. His name was Carl Jung. Carl Jung did not set out to prove that fairy tales contained psychological truths. In fact, he arrived at them from an entirely different direction. He was listening. Day after day, patients entered his office carrying dreams they could not understand. Some dreamed of ancient kings they had never studied. Others wandered through mysterious forests, encountered wise old women, crossed dangerous rivers, or confronted terrifying beasts. These images appeared with astonishing regularity, even among people who had never met each other, belonged to different cultures, and shared no common traditions. At first, this seemed impossible. How could the human mind produce the same symbolic patterns again and again without copying them from one another? The deeper Jung looked, the stranger the mystery became. He began comparing his patients' dreams with myths, religious traditions, ancient legends, and eventually the oldest fairy tales he could find. To his surprise, the same invisible architecture seemed to organize them all. Different stories, different centuries, different civilizations. Yet beneath the surface, the same journey unfolded repeatedly. Someone leaves the familiar world. Chaos interrupts ordinary life. A guide appears. A shadow must be confronted. A sacrifice becomes necessary. And only through transformation can a new sense of wholeness emerge. Jung realized he was not looking at isolated stories. He was looking at recurring patterns of the human psyche itself. This insight led him to one of his most influential ideas, the collective unconscious. Unlike personal memories, which belong only to one individual, the collective unconscious contains inherited psychological patterns shared by humanity as a whole. Jung called these patterns archetypes. They are not learned. They are not invented. They are possibilities already woven into the structure of the human mind, waiting to take symbolic form in dreams, myths, religions, and fairy tales. Suddenly, the old stories looked entirely different. The wolf was no longer just an animal. The forest was no longer simply a place. The king, the witch, the tower, the bridge, the hidden treasure, each became a symbolic expression of inner psychological realities. Fairy tales were not preserving historical events. They were preserving the grammar of the soul. This was why they could survive across continents and centuries without losing their power. Their symbols did not belong to one culture alone. They emerged from something far older and far more universal than language itself. But if Jung discovered the hidden structure beneath these stories, one of his closest collaborators would dedicate her life to exploring every corner of that symbolic landscape. Her name was Marie-Louise von Franz, and she would reveal why fairy tales may be the clearest mirror of the human soul ever created. If Carl Jung discovered that fairy tales spoke the language of the unconscious, Marie-Louise von Franz dedicated her life to learning how to read that language. For more than 40 years, she immersed herself in stories collected from every corner of the world. At first glance, they seemed impossibly different. Some unfolded in frozen kingdoms, others in dense forests or forgotten deserts. Their heroes ranged from abandoned children to humble shepherds, from silent princesses to wandering fools. Yet beneath their countless variations, von Franz kept finding the same invisible rhythm. The stories changed. The psyche did not. This became one of her most remarkable insights. She argued that fairy tales are the purest expression of the collective unconscious because they have been stripped of almost everything that belongs to a specific culture. Unlike myths, which often become intertwined with religion, politics, or historical figures, fairy tales preserve only what is psychologically essential. What remains is not history, it is structure. This is why von Franz often described fairy tales as a kind of laboratory. Not a laboratory filled with scientific instruments, but one in which the hidden movements of the human soul could be observed with extraordinary clarity. Every character has a function. Every obstacle appears for a reason. Every strange event reveals an inner transformation. The old woman encountered at the edge of the forest is rarely just an old woman. The mysterious animal that offers guidance is never merely an animal. The castle hidden beyond the mountains is more than a destination. Each image represents a psychological force interacting with another, creating a symbolic drama that unfolds inside every human life. This is also why fairy tales rarely waste words. Their simplicity is deceptive. A single sentence may contain an entire stage of psychological development. A journey through the forest may represent years of inner uncertainty. A locked door may symbolize an aspect of the personality that has never been explored. A golden key may appear only for an instant, yet point toward an entirely new way of being. Von Franz believed these stories survived because they never belonged to one generation alone. They belong to the psyche itself. Each time someone listens to a fairy tale, the symbols awaken once again, not because they teach new information, but because they recognize something ancient already living within us. And if every fairy tale is, in some sense, an experiment conducted by the unconscious, then one question naturally follows. What is the invisible pattern these stories are trying to complete? To answer that question, we must turn to the deepest archetype in Jungian psychology, the one silently guiding every genuine journey of transformation, the self. If fairy tales are maps of the human soul, then every map must lead somewhere. For Carl Jung, that destination was not success, not happiness, not perfection. It was something far more profound. He called it the self. The self is one of the most misunderstood ideas in Jungian psychology. It is not the ego, the personality we present to the world, or the image we build through our achievements. The ego is the part of us that says, "This is who I think I am." The self asks a different question. Who am I capable of becoming? It is the hidden center of the psyche, quietly drawing every genuine transformation toward greater wholeness. Seen through this lens, fairy tales begin to reveal an extraordinary secret. Their heroes are rarely born extraordinary. They are often the youngest child, the forgotten daughter, the neglected prince, the orphan, the fool, or the one everyone underestimates. Why? Because the journey never begins with power. It begins with incompleteness. Something essential is missing. A kingdom falls into disorder. A parent disappears. A curse spreads across the land. A forest blocks the way. The familiar world can no longer sustain life. This moment of disruption is not an accident. It is the beginning of psychological transformation. Again and again, the hero is forced to leave behind certainty and enter the unknown. Along the way, they encounter terrifying creatures, impossible tasks, mysterious helpers, and unexpected moments of grace. Every challenge strips away another illusion, another fear, another false identity. The true battle is never against the dragon. It is against the fragmented self that believes it can remain unchanged. This is why the ending of a fairy tale is almost never about victory alone. The treasure is not merely gold. The crown is not simply power. The marriage is not just romance. These are symbolic images of integration. They represent a personality that has learned to reconcile opposites, to unite courage with vulnerability, strength with compassion, reason with imagination, light with shadow. This is the work of the self. Marie-Louise von Franz often emphasized that fairy tales describe psychological processes rather than moral lessons. They do not promise an easy life or guarantee a happy ending. Instead, they suggest that every crisis contains the possibility of becoming more fully ourselves if we are willing to continue the journey. Perhaps that is why these ancient stories still move us. They remind us that beneath every period of confusion lies the possibility of a deeper order waiting to emerge. And once we recognize that pattern, one final question remains. If these stories have always been guiding the human soul, what are they still trying to tell us today? When we close a fairy tale, the story ends. But the symbols do not. They remain quietly alive, waiting for the moment when life itself begins to resemble the path we once followed through those imaginary worlds. Perhaps that is why these stories never truly disappear. They wait, sometimes for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime. Then, almost without warning, we find ourselves standing at a crossroads, walking through a season of uncertainty, facing a loss we never expected, or searching for a direction that no map seems able to provide. And suddenly, the old stories no longer feel imaginary. They feel familiar. The forest becomes every period of confusion when we cannot see what lies ahead. The wolf becomes the fear we avoid until avoiding it is no longer possible. The witch becomes the voice that promises comfort while quietly demanding that we surrender our freedom. The forgotten prince or abandoned girl becomes the neglected part of ourselves that has waited patiently to be recognized. Without realizing it, we begin to understand that fairy tales were never asking us to believe in magic. They were asking us to recognize ourselves. This is why Carl Jung believed symbols are not relics of ancient civilizations. They are living realities that continue to emerge wherever human beings struggle, dream, love, despair, and hope. The symbolic world did not disappear with the modern age. We simply became less fluent in its language. Marie-Louise von Franz warned that when symbolic understanding fades, life itself can begin to feel strangely flat. We may continue achieving goals, solving problems, and filling our calendars, yet still sense that something essential remains untouched. Not because meaning has vanished, but because meaning rarely speaks through efficiency. It speaks through images, relationships, dreams, imagination, and the quiet movements of the soul. Perhaps this is why fairy tales have endured for centuries, while so many other stories have been forgotten. They do not offer instructions. They offer orientation. They do not tell us what decisions to make. They remind us that every genuine transformation asks us to walk into the unknown before we understand where the path is leading. And maybe that is the forgotten wisdom they have been protecting all along. The soul does not lose its way because it lacks answers. It loses its way when it forgets the language that gives those answers meaning. Perhaps the oldest stories in the world have survived for one simple reason. They have never stopped trying to lead us home. Perhaps the greatest mistake we have made is believing that fairy tales belong to the past. Maybe they have been speaking about the present all along. Every forest we fear to enter, every shadow we struggle to face, every impossible journey we believe we are not ready to take. These stories have walked those paths before us, not because they predict our future, but because they understand the patterns of the human soul. Carl Jung once suggested that until we become conscious of what lives within us, it shapes our lives from behind the scenes. Marie-Louise von Franz spent decades showing that fairy tales preserve this hidden wisdom in its simplest and most timeless form. Perhaps that is why these stories continue to move us. They remind us that no matter how lost we feel, others have walked through darkness before us and found their way home. If this journey changed the way you see fairy tales, let it be the beginning, rather than the conclusion. In the episodes ahead, we won't simply revisit famous stories. We'll step inside them. We'll discover why Little Red Riding Hood is far more than a tale about a wolf. Why Beauty and the Beast reveals the transformation of the instinctive soul. Why the Snow Queen speaks to the frozen heart. Why Peter Pan confronts our fear of growing up. And why every great fairy tale may describe a different chapter of the same inner journey. If these ideas resonated with you, consider subscribing to Unconscious Wisdom and becoming part of a community dedicated to exploring the hidden language of the psyche through the works of Carl Jung, Marie-Louise von Franz, and the timeless wisdom preserved in fairy tales. And before you leave, I'd like to ask you one question. What fairy tale has stayed with you since childhood, even if you never understood why? Leave your answer in the comments. It may reveal more about your inner journey than you ever imagined. Until next time, remember, the oldest stories are not the ones we leave behind. They are the ones patiently waiting for us to finally understand them.